Um, my name is Rihanna Putnam. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist for the Citizen Science Association. I'm joined today by Julie Pastine, who's the Director for the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring, or ALARM, at Dickinson College, and she's a member of our CSA board. Today she'll be introducing our panelists and moderating the session. I have a few slides about the CSA and just a couple of housekeeping things, and then I'll turn it over to our presenters to get going. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, the Citizen Science Association is a member-driven organization that connects people from a wide range of experiences around a shared purpose of advancing knowledge through research and monitoring done by, for, and with members of the public. This work takes place in almost every discipline and requires a wide range of skills. Our efforts are concentrated into a biennial conference. Our next one's going to be in May 2021 in Phoenix. We have a peer-reviewed journal, and we also have member services such as our working groups, online networking opportunities, and webinars like these. Our membership represents the multidisciplinary and multidimensional nature of the field and includes project leaders, researchers, educators, and more. Membership dues support the association's mission and activities like these. We encourage you to join or renew. You can find out more information on our website. Getting involved with the CSA is a great way to make connections, grow as a leader in the field, and help support the association. Our working groups are one of the key ways that we work to advance the field and advance the goals of the association through the sharing of resources, best practices, and relevant information, both among group members and also to the broader citizen science community. You can find resource guides, archives of past webinars and things all on our website that our working groups have produced. We have 9 working groups that explore cross-cutting issues like ethics, data and metadata, policy evaluation, and more. You can find out more on our website. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to a playlist where we archive past webinars on topics such as research ethics, privacy, and consent. There's one from last July that's also on volunteer retention from University of Minnesota Extension that might be of interest to folks on this call. I encourage you to go to our website and look for those. I'll link to that webinar in particular in the chat. We have several webinars coming up, and we'll be updating our registration pages early next week. We have one at the end of February on looking at the special issue of our journal on policy, and so we'll have some case studies presented then, and then also again in April there'll be another one where we'll be diving into some of the articles from there. There's some more from our policy group and also some on ethics scheduled for March and April. Though this webinar was free to register, we still encourage you to make a donation of any amount if you're in a position to pitch in. We believe that community-supported webinars, particularly those from our working groups and led by volunteers, shouldn't be paywalled. If you find value from this learning opportunity and have the means, you can help cover some of the hard costs to keep webinars free for those who can't pay. I'll link in the chat, or you can simply text webinar to the number 44321 to be linked to the donation page. Lastly, we do have everyone in the call today on listen-only mode to keep background noise to a minimum. We are expecting a good-sized crowd. We do want to get to know more about you and for you to feel that this is a place where you can ask questions, and so you can use the chat box. If you don't see the chat box in the bottom, check for it under the ... You'll want to address all of your questions to all panelists and attendees so we can all see your questions. And if you haven't already, go ahead and introduce yourself there. Lastly, if you are interested in live tweeting this webinar, we encourage you to do so. You can use the hashtag #CitSciWebinar and we'll try to retweet some of those threads. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie to introduce our panelists. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rihanna. As Rihanna said, I am Julie Pastine, and I direct Dickinson College's Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring in Pennsylvania, and I'm also a Citizen Science Association board member. Volunteer monitoring or aquatic citizen science has a robust history in the United States, and it's exciting to share lessons learned as a part of Citizen Science Association's webinar series. Today's topic is a popular one, not only in volunteer monitoring, but the greater sea science field. Effective volunteer management is a critical component of every successful volunteer-based data collection program. This webinar will share best practices for volunteer recruitment, retention, and engagement over time. It is my pleasure to introduce two fantastic colleagues, Elizabeth Herron and Chris Stepanek. Elizabeth Herron is the program director of University of Rhode Island's Watershed Watch, a program she's been a part of for more than 25 years, and she collaborates with 350 volunteers throughout Rhode Island, southeastern Connecticut, and Fishers Island, New York. Elizabeth works regionally and nationally to help build capacity of volunteer monitoring groups and watershed associations, including with emerging water quality issues such as cyanobacteria, invasive species, and more. So Elizabeth will get things started. But after Elizabeth is Dr. Chris Stepanek, who is the Extension Program Leader for Lake Champlain Sea Grant and Extension Assistant Professor of Watershed Science, Policy, and Education in the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. Chris, that's quite a mouthful. Okay. For more than 20 years, she has focused her career to build community connections to and understanding of the impact our actions have on the health of streams, rivers, and lakes. She also served on the inaugural board of the Citizen Science Association from 2014 to 2018. And a reminder to everyone, as you have questions, as Elizabeth and Chris are presenting, please direct them to the chat function to all panelists and attendees. And with that, Elizabeth Herron, will you please take it away?
Excellent, thank you. Chris is going to be running the slides here, I think. So,
yes, how's that?
Okay, so there you go, perfect. So thank you very much. And from looking at the folks that are attending and participating in this, Chris, if you want to go to the next one. I kind of feel like we're preaching to the choir here, but we did want to share some of our experience. We're going to talk about why we do not want to use volunteers. And I know that may sound a little crazy with this group, but I'll explain more about that. And then we'll get into the best management practices and really go over a lot of the R's, roles and responsibilities, recruitment, retention, and recognition. Next one, please. So often when we've got a limited resources, someone will come up with a great idea that why don't we just use volunteers? This will be a great way of stretching our funds. And that may sound good, but next, we really don't want to use volunteers. As you can see, this is a kind of a word picture of all the concepts and ideas that actually Chris came up with about this idea of citizen science, volunteer monitoring, and nowhere on there do you see the word tool. Our volunteers are not tools. They are people who want to be actively engaged and are participating usually for some personal reason. So we want to always make sure that when we're thinking about volunteers, we're not thinking of them, we're not using these volunteers, that we're actually trying to engage them in some way. Next. So we need to engage them in activities that matter to them, that are also helping support our program goals. We want to make sure that we are doing, it's a two-way street in terms of communication, in terms of understanding why they're participating and what they're doing. Remember, they're giving us often a lot of time, money, resources, and we want to make sure that it's worth their while as well as ours. So knowing why they volunteer is important. Next, and Chris will actually go into this a lot more, but scientists and particularly psychologists have figured out that when it comes to volunteering, people do so often for a variety or multiple reasons, but they generally break down into about 5 categories. They values, doing something that reflects their own concern, their own social values, community concern. They're concerned about a water body. They're concerned about something that's happening in their area. They might want to be feeling better about themselves or about getting involved and kind of getting that good feeling that we often get. They may want to understand science. They may want to understand what's going on in their backyard, or things are not quite what they remember them being like, and want to learn how that works. And also personal development, particularly over this last decade or so, where we had a lot of employment anxiety. There is research to show that people who were active volunteers were able to get back to work more quickly. They were able to build skills and were able to use their volunteer commitment to help support their own personal activities. So people volunteer for lots of different reasons. Next. So understanding why our volunteers are getting involved is really important. We can't just be thinking about the fact that our programs need more people to work or access to places. We need to be really thinking about how we can do something with them and for them while we are also getting the benefits of information. So often we'll hear, and I've had experiences working with local agencies in particular, that when there's a project and some information they need, someone will say, well, why don't we just use volunteers and we can just have, our so-and-so will answer the phone and deal with the volunteers. How hard can it be? If you're doing it right, it should be a lot more involved than that. Next. So we know that our local residents, our local volunteers are doing this typically because they love a particular water body or they love being outdoors. But to be successful as a volunteer manager, it takes a good deal of time, it takes a good deal of effort, often certain skills that are unique perhaps, and often working with the volunteers and actively engaging them and finding out kind of what makes them tick and what they're interested in is often the most kind of exciting part of the program. It's not just training volunteers and sending them out. You really need to understand what it is that they want to achieve and also make sure that it fits in well with what you're trying to achieve. Next.
So taking the reins from Elizabeth, I'm going to talk here about rights and responsibilities, rights of both the volunteer and of the program, and responsibilities, again, both of the program and of the volunteer. So one of the things we were talking about as we were preparing for this webinar, as Elizabeth mentioned, is, it looks like a lot of you are out there and doing this kind of work. And so as I was going through and thinking about examples of some of these rights and responsibilities, what I realized is it's something that I don't necessarily think about all the time, and it's really good to revisit and to say, am I doing that now in the program that I'm working with? I maybe have done it in the past or learned the lesson in the past, but just as you listen today, thinking about, are you doing these things, or where might you tweak something to be able to make sure that those rights and responsibilities are being met. So one of the things about the volunteers having a right is to be provided a relevant orientation and training. And from the program perspective, that can help you ensure that your volunteers not only know what they're supposed to do, but they have a background. They understand where your program is coming from and what's your goal, what's the ultimate goal, and understanding that base, and then being able to align that with their own thinking about if what you're trying to do really aligns with what they're trying to do. To have appropriate assignments, making sure that people, again, are aware, what are the specific things that you're asking them to do? Are you asking them to go out in the winter to monitor? Are you asking them to be doing data entry, and making sure that those assignments that you're giving them align with what they're able physically, mentally, financially, and in time commitment able to do? Making sure that they have fulfilling work. In the case of the volunteers who are being asked to go out and do something that you think is important, but they don't necessarily understand why, they need to be able to feel like their time is not being wasted. So an example I have from when I worked in Wisconsin for 15 years, we had a volunteer retention rate of about 2 years when our program was set up as a purely educational program. And one of the things that was happening at that time is the volunteers, the program was, hey, we have this program so we can teach people so they can understand what's happening locally in their stream, and that should motivate them to continue over time. So people, again, were about 2 years sticking around to learn. And when they weren't seeing that their data were being used in ways that helped them solve local community problems, they didn't stay. When the program changed, we added multiple levels of the program: educational level, research level, and third, and in the middle, we had a management and kind of making status decisions and impairment decisions to try to be able to take action on the ground and be able to do something about the water quality that the volunteers were identifying. Our retention rate went from the 2 years up to 6 years, and we literally had people dying out of the program where they monitored right up until the day that they died. And the other thing to think about is, are you recognizing your volunteers for their contributions? Are you, one of the things that I know people appreciate is seeing their name in a newsletter or in a social media post, that, hey, I am aware that you're out there and you're doing this, giving of your time and your talents to be able to collect water quality data. Another piece of the puzzle in terms of the volunteer rights is they have a right to have that program, organization, agency, whoever's sponsoring the volunteer monitoring program, to understand what they're doing, to be having communication back and forth, and I'll say that again in a few slides, making sure that they have the materials and the equipment and the training that they need to be able to go out and do an effective job collecting the data that the program says it wants to be collecting. And part of that has to do with respecting the volunteers to how much time are you asking of them? What are you doing with the data once they've been collected? Are they sitting in a Excel file someplace, not being analyzed? Are they being shared in press releases and using in state presentations to the state legislature? Or are they kind of waiting to be analyzed until some other later point in time? And so volunteers, again, it relates to retention. They have that right to be respected and to have their time put to good use. In terms of safe working conditions, an example I wanted to share here is in Wisconsin and also here in Vermont, where I'm based now, we had volunteers who are heading out into the winter sampling, and they're doing monitoring for looking at impacts of road salt on streams. And one of the things we did when we planned the Wisconsin program, which I brought here to Vermont, is that we wouldn't be having people monitor on large water bodies because there's a risk to people's safety to have them out in conditions that are cold waters, potential to fall in, and we just didn't want that to happen. The other thing that we decided to do is to, if there was ice on a stream, that we said to the volunteers, you write that down on your data sheet, and then you can leave. We don't want you trying to break through the ice to get the data. Comparatively, programs have a right to make sure that the volunteers are ready and raring to go. They have a right, and I don't know how many of you, it would be an interesting poll to do, is how many people screen their volunteers? And that could be as simple as having a volunteer a form where the volunteers are filling out information about themselves and letting them know why they're interested in volunteering, and then you can see if that matches with what your needs are. But you could also do something more formal and have an interview with potential volunteers to see if what you're looking for really matches with what the volunteers are looking for. I think this might be the most important next thing I'm about to say of anything in this presentation from my experience is requiring volunteers to attend trainings and in their entirety. It's super hard. It's super hard when people say, oh, I have this meeting, I have to go pick up the kids, I have to do this other thing. But really, if people can't commit to learning what it is that you need them to do to collect data in the 1 or 2 or 3 or however many hours you're asking them to be there, first you have to question, can they do it effectively, because do they really know what they're doing? A lot of people say they'll read the methods or whatnot, but really hands-on, having people fill the box and close the box and seal that sample so that it's not going to leak and be rejected by the U.S. Postal Service, or it won't run hot and not be accepted by the lab. It's very important to stand your ground and have people attend trainings in their entirety. And part of that is expecting volunteers to be responsible, whether that's at their site. I've never had a volunteer sort of be disrespectful of other people that I'm aware of, but being responsible to you, the program, letting you know if they're going to be away and miss a sample collection date, making sure you know if they're not able to participate anymore. And so one of the things we wanted to really talk about is being able to fire a volunteer. So that's okay. It's uncomfortable, and one of the ways to avoid having to actually let someone go is to really set clear expectations when you bring people into the program. What is it you're expecting? What's the time commitment that's involved? What is it you're going to be asking them to do? Do they have to move down slippery banks? Do they need to be out in inclement weather? What time of year? Making sure that they really understand what it is you're asking of them, so that you don't have to get to that point of letting them go when they aren't able to commit to what you need. I think the other side of that is you also need to know for your own program, why do you exist? I remember when I first started working in Wisconsin, I didn't really understand how the program had started, and understanding what the goal of the program was and why we have people going out is really important. If you don't know that about your program, you should figure that out to help your volunteers be able to have that success. So volunteering also has responsibilities, and these things that I've been talking about really go hand in hand with one another. They should understand what they're supposed to be doing. They should be honest about what they actually can do and their time commitment available, or their time available, and what skills they have, and do those meet your needs. Kind of an important one, and it gets at where I said the retention time expanded for folks when we created a multi-tiered program in Wisconsin, is fulfilling their commitment. We had volunteers who were very good. We said, this is what we need for this year. We need you to be collecting 6 samples. And it's a nice, clear opportunity. If people say, if this is what my commitment is for the year, if they, at the end of the year, if it was too much, they'd done what they could do. It's kind of nice to do it in segments to let them decide annually if they can continue to fulfill that commitment. As you probably know from your own programs, being flexible, open-minded about what might have to change over time. For instance, we had some sites that were randomly selected along a railroad, and the railroad, the train company said, no, you can't be walking down the railroad to do this. So we had to shift the site slightly. So having some ability to change as conditions change is important for the volunteers. Making sure they stay informed. We've had times where the volunteer methods were updated, and we needed the volunteers to be paying attention to the communications that we were sending out, so that they knew what the new way of doing the methods was. I remember receiving some data sheets in the old method about 5 years after we had changed, and thinking, oh my goodness, this is not good that these people had missed that. But it's also a lesson to myself, is making sure having a relationship with the volunteers, and depending on how big your program is geographically, having trained local coordinators who can be that person to know your volunteers one-on-one is super important, because sometimes the last one here is asking for help. It really helps to have that person who's really easy access for the volunteers. An example I have for asking for help is I had some volunteers doing stream flow monitoring, and what they had to do is one piece of it was to float a ball down a 20-foot length of stream. And I remember having an aha moment when a volunteer, I went out in the field with them, and they said, well, I put the ball in, and then I go do the other monitoring, and about a half an hour later I come back and I check on how the ball is doing. And really the ball should have moved in 10 seconds or 30 seconds or something like that, not over 30 minutes. And so it was really important to make it recognize that the volunteers, that it's okay and that they should feel comfortable. And it helps to have somebody really local to be there for them, to help them know that they can ask for help when they need it. On the other side of the program responsibilities, a written job description, if you don't have a written job description for what you're looking for your volunteers to assist with, it's a really great idea to put something together. And you might have more than one for your program. You might, if you have a program where there's field data collection, there could be a job description for that. If there's a part of it that's data entry, could be a description for that. And maybe you have other jobs that you need volunteers to assist with that would have their own job description. It gives you a different opportunity to get different kinds of people with different skills, and it really makes it clear for them. I've already talked about interviewing folks and screening people for making a good connection, providing training. Supervision is getting into where I was talking about if there's not an opportunity for you to check in on them every once in a while, not that they're necessarily doing something wrong, but it gives you an opportunity to troubleshoot little things that they may have solved in one way that might not be exactly how you want to be able to get good data. I think one of the things we all face is the question of data quality in volunteer monitoring and in C science, and being able to provide that supervision gives you an insight into what's happening out there for real. And then communicating, I probably should have put this in bright yellow, big letters, is the more you can communicate, the more often, the more different ways, everything from what do these results mean that you're getting, your appreciation for the people collecting the data, what kinds of things are coming down at you as a program organization that's coordinating a program that's going to influence or potentially influence the volunteers, sharing all that with the volunteers and making sure over time that they do understand what's happening and why. Respecting the volunteer contributions, I talked about that a little bit before. And then one thing that can be really useful is if you have the capacity to do exit interviews and ask the volunteers why are they leaving, that can really help inform your program as you move forward. So just in terms of a job description, there's some great examples I'll give you on the next slide, but you're looking at what's the goal, who are they going to be working with, what are those tasks you're specifically asking people to do, what kinds of conditions are they going to be in, how long is it going to take in a certain one monitoring session or over a year, what kinds of skills or qualifications do they need, and where are they going to learn that, or how are they going to learn that. One page is great, they can see it pretty easily. This is an example from Elizabeth's program at URI Watershed Watch. There's two other places that I can send you, and Elizabeth and I are teaching this webinar today from a fact sheet that we have about volunteer management and support. If you visit the USA Volunteer Monitoring Network website, which is volunteermonitoring.org, and you go under Guide for Growing Programs, there's a number of different fact sheets there. This one is volunteer management, and if you go to page 13, these two links for the Southern Maine Beach Profile Monitoring Program, there's job description examples that they have. There's also a volunteer manager handbook that has a job description template, and we just updated all the links in that entire document to make it relevant to all of you, hopefully, in terms of volunteer engagement and management.
Excellent, Chris. Thank you. I was about to mention that I forgot to tell folks at the beginning about our learning modules. That was part of our national work trying to support volunteer monitoring. That's actually where Chris and I met. So now we're going to talk about recruitment. You've decided that volunteers are a useful group to communicate and engage with, and you want to get moving. How do you get volunteers actively involved in your program? And recruitment is really an ongoing process. And one of the things that sometimes people kind of think, well, I'll get the program going. I'll recruit volunteers, and we'll figure out the details later. And it's really important to understand that if you have a really good program, recruitment is relatively easy, and you can do it kind of on an ongoing way, or you can do it, you need volunteers starting on this date and then every year after. So it really depends on what your program needs are, what your approach is, but having a good program first is really important. Chris, next. Lots of different ways of finding folks. We kind of practice in all of the above approach. I still love newspapers because it's a local, in most cases, at least in our state here in Rhode Island, we've got lots of local papers. People maybe aren't looking at the big state or national paper, but they love looking at their local paper, seeing what's going on in their own backyard. So, we still work with newspapers and find that we get, a good number of folks that way. Community organizations are excellent, working, either directly with them or asking them to, put your information in their newsletters or on their websites. Shoreline residents, obviously, if you've got a particular water body or watershed you're working in, trying to reach out to people through whatever, putting flyers up in local post offices or at their lake association meetings, that kind of thing. We work with a lot of sporting groups, things like Trout Unlimited or Bass Federation or folks who already have active, engaged folks who have a focus on a particular area are really good to working with some of these organizations. Fairs, festivals, anytime you can get out in front of the public and talk about your program, let people know what you're doing is really, really important. Brochures still, leaving them in our local supermarket. I'm always so impressed by the number of different organizations, promoting themselves there and getting good attention. Word of mouth and social media, really, all things that we need to actively be using to try and get folks involved. Next. Social media is something I still sort of struggle with. Like I said, I still really like newspapers because they get out to people that you may not already know, whereas with social media, it seems like you're kind of preaching to people that you already know about, but social media is the way to go. It's kind of the wave of the future, so it's important that we be actively engaged in it. In fact, actually, there's a lot of folks who are now sharing information on how to use social media effectively. I would really strongly recommend trying to find some of those groups, and I'll share some. I've got on my notes, I've got a couple of links I'll put into the chat box before this is over. But social media can be time consuming to do effectively. So it's something that if you make the commitment to it, you really need to kind of think about it and strategize and put some, kind of dedicated time into it. Some keys to making social media effective for recruitment. You need to share compelling content, keep things interesting, post exciting thing. If you're doing something about, here every spring we love to count the herring as they come upstream. We've got lots of folks that get actively engaged in that. So posting pictures of the fish moving upstream, posting information about the fish before they get here to get people interested, can be really good. Posting regularly about your program. This is something Chris mentioned earlier, how even though we've been doing this a long time, sometimes we kind of forget the best management practices and we forget that, what we should be doing. We get on autopilot, and this is something that I really struggle with social media, keeping up on it and posting, where our program is, what we're doing, what impacts we're making, what our volunteers are up to. We want people to feel that, our projects are worthwhile and worth their time and effort. We want to educate our audience. We're doing the monitoring with our volunteers, not only to generate water quality data and information, but also to get them to understand why this is important. What does it mean when, dissolved oxygen levels get low, or what's causing those things? So it's important that our social media be, kind of encouraging people to be curious. Make signing up. If you want to recruit volunteers, particularly via social media, make sure that you've got information right there in your post. Here, click here to sign up. Click here to register. You want to make it as easy as possible. This is something, again, social scientists have looked at. You can get a much higher rate of response if people don't have to go look something up elsewhere. This is why almost all websites have a place, buy now place on them, because people are much more likely to respond if they can just click and just register right then and there. Ensure that your communications, particularly via social media, are two-way. You can't just post something and then walk away and never respond to comments or never respond to questions. And this is something, again, that I struggle with social media, because you really need to be going back to it regularly, answering people's questions, giving them the opportunity to ask questions, and post feedback. So I highly recommend learning and figuring out what kind of social media works for you. Do you have the time and effort? And maybe this is something that can be a good thing for volunteers. If you've got particularly younger volunteers are really savvy in social media, this may be a good way to get volunteers involved in helping get your program to reach out to other people. I would strongly advise, if you do work with volunteers to help with your social media, that you make sure you check their posts before they send stuff out, because sometimes things may get misinterpreted, but social media is certainly a good tool. Next. Don't forget your volunteers. They are, for our program now, our really #1 recruitment. They're talking to their friends and families. They're, people get excited because they enjoy the program, they enjoy what we're doing, and they think it has value. So in our most recent program evaluation, the majority of our volunteers heard about the program from someone they knew. Someone told them about it, someone asked them to participate, and so they really are our most important recruiters. We also find that our website and our listserv are pretty effective, and a lot of those other colors on that pie chart there are actually different versions of I heard about it through someone who was already involved. So really, find out from your volunteers, are there other groups that they should be talking to? Can they come to a festival and talk about what you're doing? Because they're the ones that they not only can they recommend the program, but in this day and age where we're all looking to see how many stars a particular item got, or what the Yelp review is, they're kind of our human Yelp reviewers. So we want to take advantage of their enthusiasm and have them share what they know. Next, I think Chris.
Yes, back to me. So just thinking about why do people leave, and how do we keep them? So sometimes the reasons people leave are not something that we can control. They have health problems, it's time to raise a family, and they just don't have time to commit anymore. They die, that happens even out of volunteer monitoring programs, and they just can't do it anymore. Some of these problems or these reasons people leave are within the program's control, though. And one of the big ones is not giving people feedback. That communicate that I said earlier. If you're not getting people information back about what their data mean, or giving them data in a way that they don't understand how to interpret it, that can cause people just loss of interest. They don't get it. They don't understand what you're doing. They don't know why. Why are they taking their time? Everybody's busy. Another one is if you don't match the people to what you are looking for. So if people are expecting to be able to solve their specific problem at a specific water body based on a program that wasn't designed to monitor the problem that's in that water body, and also to make the connections with the right government agencies or local agencies to be able to solve the problem, working with commissions, people might become frustrated and leave. So that's something where you have a way to keep people, or to not have them come on in the first place, is to set those expectations early and do that screening process. Another way that it's something that's within the program's control is people don't, they're kind of bored. They've been doing what they've been doing for a long time. It hasn't changed. They know how to do it. And one of the tricks here, and maybe also a caution at the same point in time, is you can teach people advanced information about a parameter or about that aspect of science, and offer people webinars to learn more, or in-person trainings, or events that give them an opportunity to learn. But be cautious. This no new challenges, one of the things that I fell into in the past is giving people new parameters to monitor, and not realizing, or even new programs that are kind of synergistic with your program. Hey, maybe you want to monitor butterflies while you're out there. And what I didn't realize is people were thinking that they had to do all these things, and then they were becoming overwhelmed with too many things to monitor and too many programs to be participating in. So be careful about where you're going with that. So what can you do? What's an action plan? You can have events. One of the reasons that we know people are volunteering is because they are able to be social with one another and to make a connection each time they go out to monitor with a group of people. So giving them opportunity to have a connection to a group, having quick turnaround with when they're giving you data and what that means and how that's being used and how that's meaningful in the realm of your world and your science field. Making sure that you're using a variety of feedback types, different generations. The baby boomers are more of a phone calling generation. The Gen Xers are more of an email generation. The millennials are more of a texting or social media and specific, right? Instagram versus Facebook is more for the Gen Xers. So how are you getting your feedback to people and who's your audience? Know your people and give them that feedback in a way that they respond to. Again, back to effective screening, making sure that you're pulling in the right people who are fit for what your goals are and that meets with their goals. Again, adding new challenges. One of the things that's kind of fun is to give your volunteers more responsibilities than just being a data collector. And I did some research for my PhD that looked at volunteer water monitoring programs in the United States and looking at what different kinds of volunteer programs. You may be familiar with this contributory, collaborative, co-created, collegial definition. Jennifer Shirk and others have defined those. And programs that are contributory are designed by scientists and the volunteers simply are data collectors. This pie chart shows the % of US volunteer water monitoring programs that are each of these types. Collaborative programs are the biggest piece of the volunteer water monitoring world. That means that scientists are designing them, but the public not only are contributing data, but they're being engaged in other ways, project design, analyzing data, sharing results. So it's a way to think about retention, but it's also a way to think about having outcomes for policy and management. Part of my research looked at what are the characteristics of volunteer water monitoring programs that are significantly connected with having reported outcomes for natural resources policy and management. The list here shows the 6 traits or characteristics of the programs that were related to programs reporting outcomes for policy and management. One of those is the number of volunteer roles. Selecting sites, communicating results, analyzing data, they all collected data as well. But the more volunteer roles, the more roles the volunteers played, the more likely those programs were to have influenced policy and management. So just something to consider. So the biggest thing in summary for recognition is making sure, or sorry, retention is making sure that the volunteers are recognized and that you are using the information that they're helping to collect or grateful for their time. It really is, it's not possible to have these programs, these CSI programs operate without volunteers, but it's also not going to continue if we aren't thanking them and recognizing them for the efforts that they're giving. So I think I'm
excellent. So, yeah, so I've actually been reading some of the chats there and mentioned school groups and school children being recruited. One of the things we're finding here in Rhode Island is that a lot of our public schools in particular have a requirement that students do some kind of community service or some kind of a senior project. So we find that we're getting a lot of students via that. And also often because, you know, our volunteers are often on the water in a boat and that sort of thing, they have to do it with a parent. And so we've had a number of students that basically drag their parents kicking and screaming out to do the monitoring. The kid goes on to graduate, goes to college. Often we're finding in the sciences, that's why they probably chose that as a science, as their commitment. And then the parents just kind of got engaged and they stick around. We've had a number of students now who have, you know, basically gotten their entire families involved. And I've now had several of our volunteers who've gone off to college, come back to the state, gotten jobs, and are now kind of into the second generation of monitoring. So it's kind of exciting to see those kinds of connections. So as Chris mentioned, you know, recognition, we cannot recognize our volunteers often enough, and there's just no way to not kind of pile on the different forms and that sort of thing. We find that, you know, one really simple way of recognizing them is to constantly realize that, you know, their comfort, their, you know, their valuable to us is by feeding them. We used to call it care and feeding of volunteers, and quite literally having food available every time we do a training, every time we have a sampling event where our volunteers are coming to us. We always have food available. Last summer we had one of our water collections during the hottest week of the summer. It was over 100 degrees pretty much throughout the water collection time period. So I made sure we had coolers full of bottles of ice water. Even though we hate bottled water, our volunteers really appreciated the fact that we were thinking about them and being aware of their health and safety, and they really appreciated that. Next one, Chris. Lots of other ways of saying thank you. Lots of groups will have events, barbecues, picnics, some kind of a social gathering, certificates, whether it's when you're having completed your training, or we give our volunteers a certificate after the monitoring season, particularly on milestone years, so 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years of monitoring. We give them certificates, we give them pins and that sort of thing. Hats, t-shirts, buttons, you know, this day and age, you know, we've got, you know, hats with things on them. It's also a nice way for our volunteers when they're out in the public. If they've got a hat with your program name on it, then it's a good way of getting the word out and recruiting new volunteers too. As Chris mentioned, enrichment classes, trying to keep people interested and engaged. As long as you don't make them think that they have to do it, but that it's sort of a treat for them to do it, that can be a really good way of recognizing their value and supporting them. Lunches, thank you letters are really good. Awards, again, our volunteers, we have a Founders Award that once a year, you know, either a group or an individual has really kind of gone over and above. We give them a special award and they get to, you know, get recognized in front of their peers. Rafting trips or other ways of, you know, kind of getting people actively, you know, integrating not when they're monitoring is always fun. Volunteer profiles, newsletters, you know, social media. If you're going to be having a forward-facing website, like Chris said, when our volunteers often just kind of like to see their names or get recognized for, you know, special work that they do. Put it out there on your website. Put it out there on your social media. Annual conferences, a lot of particularly academically based or you know, other organizations have conferences. Why not invite your volunteers and maybe give them a free registration or a discounted registration for the fact that they're giving you so much in return. One-on-one support. You know, when something happens in a local water body and, you know, you've got the data or you just know who to contact, you know, they're going to call you up, and, you know, being ready and able to support them when they have questions or when they have problems in a local water body really shows them how much you value them. Next. And most importantly, and Chris mentioned this in terms of retention, knowing that their volunteer effort is not being wasted, knowing that those data that they're collecting are actually resulting in something, whether it's the installation of BMPs in a local area or an organization getting a grant based on their data that now they're able to do something, or as something in that bottom picture, one of our organizations has a turnaround swim. It's one of their big fundraising efforts. They're able to do it partly because the water quality data they've gotten from us has confirmed that this is a safe water body and someplace that people should be recreating in. And it's now one of their biggest fundraisers, and it's kind of, you know, a cool event for them. So they know that their data are resulting in good things happening locally. And that's really, really important. They don't want to be wasting their time. Next one. Chris.
So just to summarize, is we want to make sure that the people that we are engaging to assist in whatever goal it is that your Sea Science program has, the data are good. Again, you all know that. That's probably the biggest challenge we have in terms of respect from a broader field of science. We want to make sure that good quality data, whatever it is you need for your program, and you define that by your own goals, are being collected by satisfied, well-trained volunteers. So I think for that, I will stop sharing and we will open up for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth and Chris. And a gentle reminder to all of our participants, if you have a question, please go ahead and drop it in the chat function to all panelists and attendees. And there's been some really great conversation on different recruitment ideas and things like that. So please drop those questions in the chat. To get started, and Elizabeth and Chris, I'll let you all figure out who's going to answer what question when. But there's a couple of questions around what are some examples of the volunteer intake form or something you would use to interview potential volunteers.
Elizabeth, do you want to take it or you want me?
Well, we currently use a volunteer profile form where we ask them some sort of basic questions, including what other organizations they're actively engaged with, and also what experiences they have, whether it's work experience or volunteer experiences. Actually, after listening to Chris earlier, I think I'm going to update that volunteer profile form to ask them a question that I ask my students all the time. What are they hoping to get out of the volunteering? So, that is something, our volunteer submission form is on our website. So when our folks contact us, we get a little bit of information from them before we even talk to them.
Yeah, and I haven't used forms. I more do it by interviews and just interaction with folks. But it's the same kind of thing that Elizabeth just said. Why is it you want to do this? And here's what it is that we want done. How much time it's going to take. The challenges of where you might need to be physically and how you have to get there, and then seeing if that works with them.
So a question that kind of gets at this, but when you're planning a new data collection program that will involve volunteers, how much time goes into the planning process, and what are some of the materials you feel need to be in place before you start your rollout?
So more time than you think, right?
Absolutely.
Than you plan on. And really, I think it's one thing to think about as you do it is make sure you have a team or a peer review of what you're proposing, because it's really nice. It can come out of your head or you and your colleagues' heads, but putting down, depending on what kind of program you're doing, right? We actually have one of our guide for growing programs is about developing a program, but what is the question? Why are you establishing a program? What's your goal? What level of data quality do you need? How are those data going to be collected? How are you going to train your volunteers? How are you going to collect the data, ensure the data are the quality that you need them to be? How are you sharing information back with people? How are you presenting information? And how are you building partnerships and securing your funding? All of those things need to be addressed before you start doing anything with people.
Yeah, one thing that we really recommend, because to have a really good, strong program, you do need to have all those pieces in place. And sometimes you've got this goal that we're going to monitor all the lakes in this one area. Well, what you probably ought to do is get the program, as fleshed out as you possibly can, and then go monitor a few of the lakes in one area and figure out, okay, this worked, this didn't work. Ask your volunteers, hey, what did you think? Where can we improve? So really start small, and then, knowing that you're going to build hopefully in the near future, but, kind of pilot testing the program first is so important, because you may discover things that you thought made total sense weren't really workable once you get out there with real people in the real world.
I totally agree. And one of the things that's helped me the most is being a volunteer myself, because you don't get it until you live it. And if this meter's not working when it's 0 degrees out, absolutely agree with Elizabeth on that. Test it out. And the other piece is a little bit like making your volunteers come to a full training is starting small and really, really being responsible to start small, because you don't want to bring in 100 people and have an oopsie and lose all that momentum of those people. It's much better to have 5 people, and it also makes them feel very, very, very needed, because they are, in terms of helping you troubleshoot if you're going to start small and do things with a check and balance first.
Yeah. Well, and one other thing that anecdotally we've discovered with a new volunteer, the most enthusiastic ones, the ones that show up at your training and say, oh, I love this. This is awesome. I don't want to just do one site. I'm going to do 4 sites. I've got so much time on my hands. This is going to be so awesome. Those are the volunteers that more than likely will not even finish the one site. So really try, and even your most enthusiastic volunteers, let them start small. If they really love it, then the second year you can give them 2 sites, and then the third year you can give them the third site. But we tend to find that the more enthusiasm at training day, the less follow through.
All right, so we have about 4 minutes for Q&A, and a few more questions have rolled in. So a quick question about publications and reports. How do you cite individual volunteers?
We have historically just included our volunteers, the names of the monitors when we provided a report. We have gone away from that a little bit now, just because we have so many volunteers. But we try and at least acknowledge our volunteers when we do any kind of a written report at the end. Acknowledge them, but not necessarily tag it with particular data.
Yeah, and it totally depends on how you're presenting it. When I've done site-specific reports, I do name the volunteers. I also had it where for certain research, if we've had to go through an institution review board, we actually can't name the volunteers. So you just say, we're giving credit to volunteers and we thank you and we know who you are, but we can't say who you are because of these other reasons. So it depends on the situation. They do like to see their name, and if you do, for instance, have a list of like 5-year volunteers and 10-year volunteers, and you miss somebody, that they're going to tell you, and it's fascinating to really pay attention to that.
Yes, they will.
Yeah. So one of the questions dealt with, there are volunteer requirements for high school students or school students. How do you move them from feeling obligated to volunteer to being more engaged in what the project is?
It really depends on the student. Some of them, they're just doing the work because they have to get through their community service, or they've got to get their senior project done. And others, really they're interested in the topic, and they're kind of come in a little bit pre-engaged. But again, if you provide them a good experience and they feel that they're learning a lot, they are more likely to kind of stick it out and stay engaged even after their commitment to the school is done.
I think that's also a role where you can have the students play a mentoring role. Like, well, it's screening, right? If it's just not a right fit for them, then they should not be working with you. B, if you can give them a mentoring role where they might be teaching younger students the methods after they've learned them, that's really a great responsibility. It's good for them emotionally and as leadership enhancement and whatnot as well.
A 2-part question. So one is, have you ever done incentivizing around data collection, like X number of surveys submitted receives a prize? And related to prizes and engagement, how do you fund your awards and different acknowledgement tools? Do you write those into your grants? Is that part of people's dues?
Our program actually charges local groups to participate. We don't charge the volunteers, but we charge the either a lakeside group or a community group or a town, whoever is the local sponsor. So those funds we are able to use for the food and for the hats and that kind of stuff. So that source of funding permits us to use that.
Yeah, in terms of the survey, trying to do a award, I have done that. It basically told me that was not a good mechanism for communication in what I was doing, because a lot of people didn't do it, and so I had like 3 people in the pool for the book that I was giving away. So it was more educational that we should use a different mechanism for communication than it was to get people to actually answer.
Awesome. And time for one last question, and we'll close up with logistics. If you're managing multiple projects that engage volunteers, do you have tips on keeping those projects separate, or better ways of being able to manage multiple projects at the same time?
There's a lot of overlap, and so it depends. Because we do actually have lots. I have now, I think, 6 different programs that are kind of all under the watershed umbrella. So some things we just send out, blanket emails, because it's kind of pertinent to everyone, and other things we do try and be more tailored in terms of our outreach to them. But we've been fortunate that we've kind of kept everything under the water quality umbrella, so it's not as difficult. But you do want to try and be as efficient as possible, but also, if you possibly can, tailor things to each group.
Yeah, we manage multiple listservs for different topics, and then the people that fit within those, that's how we communicate with those. Or MailChimp has a way of sectoring out groups to be able to communicate if you're using email to communicate with people.
Nice. Well, just wanted to take a moment and say thank you so much to everyone who shared this past hour together. Thank you so much to Rihanna Putnam and the Citizen Science Association for hosting today's webinar. And special thanks to our 2 fantastic presenters, Chris Stepanuk and Elizabeth Herron. And with that, I'll hand it over to Rihanna to do closing logistics.
Yeah, thank you everyone. And thanks to our presenters. This is really great and very informative and lots of questions. And we'll try to, if we didn't get to your question in the chat, we'll try to give some sort of response in a follow-up email. I'll be